Erased. That's the word for what happened to the hunter-gatherers who were already living along the Rhine and the Meuse rivers before farming ever reached Germany. Except they weren't. Not right away. Most of continental Europe saw its original hunter-gatherer populations genetically overrun when Anatolian farmers expanded westward, somewhere between 6,500 and 4,000 BCE. It happened fast. The farmers carried something the foragers didn't: a fully developed agricultural package, higher population densities, the ability to feed more people from less land. In most places, the old world simply gave way. But not here. In the Rhine-Meuse wetlands, the reed channels and tidal flats of what is now the Netherlands and Western Germany, something strange happened. In 2026, a team led by Íñigo Olalde at the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona published a landmark analysis of ancient DNA from 109 individuals spanning more than 6,000 years in that exact region. What they found was that hunter-gatherer ancestry was still running at roughly 50% as late as 2,500 BCE. 2,000 years after the farming wave had swept through the rest of Europe, these people were still here, still genetically intact. The wetland was the shield. The farming package that transformed low-S soil Germany couldn't penetrate reed-choked river channels efficiently. The geography bought the people of the Rhine-Meuse, something no one else on the continent had: time. But here's where it gets strange, because the sex of the survivors was not random. When Olalde's team looked at the X chromosome data inside that survival pattern, they found something with a very specific direction. Early European farmer ancestry was arriving through the female line. Women from the farming communities were entering hunter-gatherer settlements, but hunter-gatherer men were not moving into farming communities in the same way. It wasn't cultural blending, equal, organic, mutual. It had a direction, and that direction has a logic that archaeology is only now beginning to name out loud. There's a single woman in that dataset who captures it perfectly, buried in the Netherlands, dated to around 3,900 BCE. Her genome is 70% early European farmer by her maternal line. Her mother's ancestry traces back to Anatolia, but she was buried with Mesolithic flint tools, local tools, in the tools of the old world. She existed in two genetic realities simultaneously, and she left no record of how she navigated that. The DNA is all we have. The flint tools are the only editorial comment. And then, around 3,100 BCE, something changes. Not in Germany, not in the Rhine-Meuse wetlands, 3,000 kilometers to the east. The Yamnaya begin to move. The people who had survived the farming wave, who had held on for 2,000 years through geography and wetland and reed channel luck, would not survive what was coming. Radiocarbon dates from the earliest corded ware burials in Germany have now pushed the timeline back. Not 2,800 BCE, as textbooks stated for a decade, 3,100 BCE, 3 centuries earlier than the established chronology allowed. Which means the displacement began before the archaeology said it was even physically possible for the Yamnaya to have arrived. Moving. That's all they were doing, moving west. But the way they moved changed everything. The Yamnaya were not a raiding party. They were not an army in any modern sense. They were a mobile civilization. They had the first wheeled wagons in Eurasian history. They had domesticated horses. And they had a pastoral economy that needed no fixed land, which meant they could relocate entire communities across distances that would take settled farming cultures generations to cover. They didn't migrate. They poured. David Reich had spent years at Harvard Medical School's Department of Genetics, building the ancient DNA dataset that would finally show what that pouring looked like from the inside. In 2015, his team, working alongside Wolfgang Hack's group in Leipzig, published the numbers. And the numbers were not subtle. The ancient people buried in corded ware sites across Germany, the culture that replaced the original farmers, carried 79% Yamnaya-related ancestry. Not a minority contribution, not blending. A near total replacement of the genetic foundation of Central Europe, happening within what the archaeological record suggests was 4 to 6 human generations. Think about that. 4 to 6 generations. That's your great-great-grandparents. That's not centuries of slow cultural change. That's one family watching the world their grandparents knew disappear within their own lifetime. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. Near a village called Uhlau, in Saxony-Anhalt. These archaeologists in 2005 began excavating a set of multiple burials. Ancient DNA analysis and strontium isotope work published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2008 confirmed something nobody had found before: the oldest confirmed nuclear family in the archaeological record. A man, a woman, 2 children, 4,600 years old, buried facing each other, positioned in an embrace, all killed on the same day, in the same attack on their settlement. The man's Y chromosome haplogroup was from the steppe. He had come from the east, moved into this territory, built a life, and died defending it. On the same day his family died. He wasn't alone. The massacre site at Schöneck-Kilienstätten in Bavaria tells the same story from a different angle. 26 individuals, predominantly adult men, legs deliberately fractured after death. Ancient DNA from the victims shows predominantly Anatolian farmer ancestry, the original inhabitants, the ones who had been there before the steppe arrived. This isn't just violence, it has a direction. Someone was specifically targeting the men of the old world, and for decades, archaeologists attributed these massacre sites to warfare between competing Neolithic farming groups, neighbor against neighbor, tribe against tribe. That was the accepted explanation. It was in every textbook. The DNA from Schöneck-Kilienstätten just inverted it entirely. The dead carried LBK farmer ancestry. Their attackers left no recoverable genetic material at the site. The people who were always assumed to be the aggressors in this period, the invaders, were in fact buried in these graves. And the original Germans were the victims, not the victors, men. That's the specific target of what the genomic record shows next. Not a population in general, not a culture, the male line, the Y chromosome specifically. And when geneticists first ran the numbers on what happened to male lineages across Europe in this period, they checked their methodology twice before they believed the results. Monica Carmen had been working on this question at the University of Tartu in Estonia. In 2015, her team published a study in the journal Genome Research that documented something with no clean explanation: a catastrophic bottleneck in Y chromosome diversity across Europe and parts of Asia, centered around 3,500 to 4,000 BCE. At its lowest point, the model estimated that in parts of Europe, where there was approximately 1 breeding male for every 17 breeding females, 1 man, 17 women, the female mitochondrial DNA record, the maternal line, showed no comparable compression. Whatever happened during this period happened to fathers and sons specifically, while mothers and daughters continued. The asymmetry isn't subtle. It's written in the genome like a scar. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the models predicted. The existing models assumed gradual replacement, slow admixture, generation by generation blending. What Carmen's team and Hack's team together revealed was the signature of something more structured. A social system in which non-steppe men were excluded through violence or through institutionalized inequality or through some combination of both from passing on their lineage. The daughters of the old world survived inside the new order. The sons did not survive within it. The Derenburg-Mierenstieg 2 cemetery in Saxony-Anhalt documents this end without drama. A complete early Neolithic LBK burial ground. Hundreds of years of continuous use. The Y chromosomes buried there, haplogroups G2, A, and I, the old European farmer lineages, show a community that existed generation after generation, right up until the moment they didn't. And then the burials stop. No destruction layer, no fire evidence, no mass grave at the site itself. The community simply ceased to reproduce. The cemetery is a full stop in the middle of a sentence that never finished. Actually, if you watched our last video on where the Cherokee really came from, you already saw this exact pattern play out on a different continent, via a population whose DNA tells a completely different story than the name suggests. Did that change how you think about the relationship between identity and ancestry? Tell me in the comments. Because what's happening in this segment is structurally the same rupture. A name people whose genetic foundations turn out to be something the name was never built to contain. There are 3 things the Carmen study revealed. The third one changes how you read your own ancestry report. First, the bottleneck was real. Second, it was specific to men. Third, modern German men who carry haplogroup R1b-U106, The dominant paternal lineage in northern Germany today carry a Y chromosome that was not present in Germany 5,000 years ago. It arrived with the steppe replacement event. Every man today who carries that haplogroup carries the Y chromosome of a population that performed this demographic rupture so completely that the result is still written in his cells in 2026. Not as history, as biology, right now, in him. And here's the final piece, the one that sits uncomfortably. A 2019 analysis of ancient European Y chromosome patterns found signals consistent with a highly skewed mating structure, a small number of high-status steppe males fathering disproportionate numbers of children across multiple generations. If that model is correct, then a meaningful percentage of modern German men descend through the paternal line alone from a single ancestral male, not a people, not a tribe, one man. But where did that man come from? Because the Yamnaya didn't begin on the steppe. They were themselves the product of an earlier mixing event, an earlier meeting between populations who had no names for each other. And understanding who those populations were requires going east, further east than most European DNA videos ever travel. Iosif Lazaridis and his colleagues at Harvard Medical School's Department of Genetics spent years assembling what became one of the largest ancient DNA datasets ever built. When their 2024 analysis of 372 individuals spanning 6,400 to 2000 BCE was complete, it revealed something that rewrote the ancestry of the people who rewrote Europe. The Yamnaya were approximately 50% Eastern European hunter-gatherer and 50% something else, something that had never been properly accounted for. Population geneticists now call Caucasus hunter-gatherers, people who had lived in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains in what is now the Republic of Georgia for thousands of years before the steppe cultures took shape. They weren't farmers. They weren't classic hunter-gatherers either. They were something in between, genetically distinct from every other population on the continent. This discovery was first suspected in 2015. Nobody fully processed what it meant, until the 2024 dataset changed the resolution entirely. Because here's what that finding actually means. The question, where are Germans from, cannot be answered in Germany. It can't be answered on the steppe. It can't even be fully answered in the Caucasus. The chain keeps going back, into the Pleistocene, into populations that predate agriculture, predate pottery, predate every human institution we have a word for. There's a woman in the Reich Lab database cataloged as KK1. She died approximately 9,700 years ago in what is now the Republic of Georgia. Her genome carries the specific ancestral signal that will appear, generations later, 3,000 kilometers north, in the Yamnaya. And then thousands of years after that, in a small percentage, in a structural engineer's ancestry report under a lamp in Hamburg. She has no name. She has a catalog number. That is all the Earth kept of her. And here's what makes the replacement truly total. Not just genetic, but civilizational. The German language that Marcus speaks also traces to this Yamnaya admixture event. Not just his biology, his syntax. Says the architecture of how he forms a thought in his own mother tongue arrived with the steppe migrants. Language and DNA moved together. The replacement was genetic, linguistic, and cultural all at once. Everything that makes him German came from somewhere else. But then, a 2024 genomic scan flagged something that shouldn't exist. A Sardinian individual carrying anomalously high Caucasus hunter-gatherer signal that cannot be explained through any Yamnaya ancestry pathway, which suggests a direct, unmediated CHG-descended population survived somewhere in southern Europe into the historical period, contributing ancestry to isolated communities that the models didn't account for. A people that genomicists had declared extinct left a living trace, and nobody knows yet where they were hiding for 6,000 years. Hidden in plain sight, or so it seems. Because by now the story appears to be complete. Modern northern Germans carry roughly 50 to 60% steppe ancestry, 25 to 30% Anatolian farmer ancestry, and 10 to 15% Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. 3 populations, 3 migrations, 1 modern genome. The ancestry industry has built an entire business category on this synthesis. Every explainer video ends here. The textbooks end here. The pie chart closes. The narrator says something poetic about human connection, and the episode finishes. This is the settled answer, and it has one problem. What they found next changed everything we thought we knew about that settled answer. Roman period cemeteries across Germany, spanning the 1st through 4th centuries CE, contain individuals with genetic profiles from North Africa, from the Levant, from the Eastern Mediterranean. They're not trade anomalies. They're not outliers. Roman economic infrastructure, garrison cities, administrative centers, long-distance trade networks created sustained multi-generational genetic exchange with populations the three ancestor model was never built to account for. The city of Cologne, founded as Colonia Claudia Era Agrippinensium, has a Roman-era genetic layer that is still measurable in southwestern German populations today. The three ancestor pie chart has a fourth slice. The Ancestry apps don't label it. Then the medieval period. Between 375 and 568 CE, Gothic, Frankish, Slavic, Sharon Hunnic population movements swept through the territories that would become Germany, reshuffling the genetic composition again. A 2025 study in the journal Nature on Slavic Migration Genetics found that early medieval German populations showed significantly higher genetic variation than the Bronze Age populations that preceded them. Every layer of the settled answer conceals another layer beneath it, and then there's the layer that's barely been studied at all. The medieval Jewish communities of the Rhine Valley, in Cologne, Erfurt, Frankfurt, the communities of the Schum cities, were a genetically distinct population with deep Near Eastern ancestry, present in Germany for over 1,000 years. Their genetic contribution to the broader modern German population has not been systematically measured. They were there. They interacted with the surrounding communities for centuries. That thread exists in the genome. It simply hasn't been pulled yet. Here's the most uncomfortable reframe of everything we've covered. The category German, as a genetic cluster, did not exist at any recoverable point in history that ancient DNA can identify. Not in the Bronze Age, not the Iron Age, not during the Roman occupation. At no moment did the people living in this territory form a genetically coherent group. The category was always political. The DNA was always a negotiation. And then, in 2024, a genomic dataset from Iron Age Bavarian sites was submitted for peer review and quietly withdrawn before publication. The stated reason, methodological concerns. A preprint remains available but uncorrected. According to that partial dataset, the Iron Age Bavarian samples showed a level of Eastern admixture that doesn't slightly challenge the three ancestor framework, it contradicts it structurally. The study has not reappeared. The data sits in a holding pattern with no published resolution. The genome had to negotiate something else entirely. Something biological, something you've probably never thought of as a historical artifact. The ability to drink milk as an adult. If the Yamnaya brought cattle herding to Germany, and cattle herding is most efficiently exploited by people who can digest raw milk, then steppe ancestry and the lactase persistence gene should appear together in the genome. They should be a package. That's the assumption baked into most of what's been written about Northern European biology. The assumption is wrong. The Ian Mathieson at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania had been tracking the LCT locus, the section of the genome that controls adult milk digestion, across ancient European DNA samples. What he found was that the Yamnaya pastoralists who swept into Germany were largely drinking dairy without the gene for digesting it fully, relying instead on fermented products with reduced lactose content. A 2020 archaeogenomic study of ancient German remains confirmed it. The lactase persistence allele was near zero in Bronze Age northern Germany. The people who brought the cows to Germany couldn't fully drink the milk. Everything you've been told about Northern European biology and dairy culture, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. The gene didn't spread with the steppe migrants, and it spread later, much later, and not because life was good. The model that best fits the selection data ties the rapid rise of lactase persistence in Central and Northern Europe to repeated cycles of famine, periods during the Iron Age and early medieval era, when the ability to extract raw calories from unfermented milk was the margin between dying and not dying. The most Northern European biological trait wasn't selected for by prosperity, it was selected for by desperation. Medieval Bavarian skeletal evidence from around 800 CE shows LP allele frequency climbing sharply, the selection signal strengthening precisely during the Carolingian period, when agricultural intensification and periodic crop failure created the exact environmental pressure the model predicts. The modern German who can drink a glass of milk as an adult is, in that one specific molecular detail, a product of medieval starvation, which means what gets called Germanic biology, the physical traits people associate with Northern European ancestry, is a record assembled from disasters. The fair skin from hunter-farmer mixing thousands of years ago, the steppe ancestry from a Bronze Age demographic rupture, the dairy tolerance from medieval famine. The genome isn't a heritage, it's a list of things that almost killed the people who came before. And now for the thing that flips the whole story sideways. For 30 years, the dominant model held that Indo-European languages, the family that includes German, English, Dutch, and most of Europe's major tongues, spread with steppe genetics. Language and biology as a single package moving together. That was the consensus. A 2025 analysis of pre-steppe European linguistic substrates found grammatical structures embedded in a language isolate predating the Yamnaya expansion by at least 800 years. Language did not travel with the steppe migrants. Language may have arrived before them. The Indo-Europeans didn't bring civilization to Europe. They arrived into a linguistic world that was already forming without them. Before the Germans were the Germans, the same replacement happened somewhere else entirely, 9,000 kilometers away. And studying it reveals something about Germany that the German data alone cannot show. The Jomon people had lived on the Japanese archipelago for approximately 14,000 years when the Yayoi arrived from the Korean peninsula around 300 BCE. Rice farmers, more complex agriculture, a denser, more competitive population economy. Within roughly 600 years of their arrival, Jomon genetic ancestry in mainland Japan collapsed from near total dominance to somewhere between 10 and 30% in most regions. The mechanics are identical to what happened in Germany. Agricultural technology carriers outcompete an older population. Y chromosome diversity collapses toward the incoming group's lineages. Female ancestry shows significantly higher survival rates than male ancestry. The same sex-biased asymmetry, the same demographic speed, the same pattern, women absorbed into the new social structure, men disappearing from the reproductive record. But here's where it gets strange, and where Japan shows us something Germany can no longer show itself. The Ainu of Hokkaido still exist, a living population in northern Japan, carrying substantially higher Jomon ancestry than mainland Japanese. Why? Because the Yayoi agricultural wave couldn't fully penetrate the colder, less arable north. The Jomon survived in the geographic margins. The wetlands of the Rhine Meuse bought the old European foragers 2,000 extra years. But there was no Hokkaido. When the steppe came, there was nowhere cold enough, remote enough, inhospitable enough to shelter what remained. Germany has no Ainu. A 2019 genomic study of 11 Ainu individuals found their genomes preserving ancestral signals from a population that had diverged from mainland East Asians approximately 38,000 years ago. They are carrying Pleistocene ancestry, Ice Age ancestry, in living bodies, in 21st century Sapporo, and the equivalent European population, the Western hunter-gatherers of the Rhine and Meuse, left only trace signals in modern Europeans today, mostly concentrated in Sardinians and some Basque communities. The geographic margins in Europe simply weren't marginal enough to protect what was there, and this parallel forces a question that the German data alone cannot generate. What would modern German genetics look like today if the Rhine-Meuse people had had a Hokkaido, a cold northern margin, a geographic shield where the old ancestry could hold? The question has no answer. It can never have an answer. And the fact that it can never be answered tells you exactly what was lost, not just from Germany's genome, but from the total genetic record of our species. And then there's this. A 2022 Japanese genomics preprint argued that Jomon ancestry in mainland Japanese populations has been systematically underestimated, possibly by 2 to 3 times, due to the way reference populations were selected in earlier models. If the same calibration bias applies to European ancient DNA, and there are researchers who believe it does, then the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in modern Germans may be significantly higher than any current ancestry report shows. Not slightly off, structurally miscalibrated. Which would mean every pie chart, every Ancestry result, every breakdown ever generated for a German customer would need to be recalculated from the ground up. There is a line running across Germany. It follows, roughly, the Mittelgebirge, the central upland range, the Harz, the Thuringian forest. On the Erzgebirge, it is not on any political map. It has never marked a border, a kingdom, a treaty boundary, or a cultural frontier that any historian gave a name to. But it's there, in the DNA, north of that line, heavier steppe ancestry, stronger R, 1b-U106 and I1y chromosome signals, genetic clustering with Danish and southern Scandinavian populations with no sharp boundary between northern Germany and Denmark at all. South of it, more early European farmer ancestry, greater genetic affinity with Alpine and northern Italian populations. Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg are measurably different genomes from Hamburg and Schleswig-Holstein. This line predates every German state, every empire, every kingdom that has ever existed in this territory. It is Bronze Age geography, still written in living bodies, in 2026. Yeah, and that north-south gradient only gets more complicated the further into German history you look. The Ostsiedlung, the great medieval eastward colonization drive of the 12th through 14th centuries, created an additional genetic layer in the eastern German states that is still measurable today. Brandenburg and Saxony carry genetic signals from Slavic populations who were living in those territories before German settlement arrived. The variation within Germany isn't noise in the data. It's a stratigraphic record, a stack of every migration, every frontier push, every colonial project that played out across these latitudes for 5,000 years. And then there's the Moselle Valley. In 2023, a genealogical research project cross-referencing historical land records with Y chromosome haplogroup data found a farming family with documented property records going back to 1347, carrying a Y chromosome haplogroup called G2A, a haplogroup that traces to Anatolian Neolithic farmers, the people who were genetically erased by the steppe replacement. This family had been farming the same stretch of Moselle Valley for 120 generations after the event that was supposed to have wiped their lineage out. The LBKY chromosome didn't die completely. It survived in one family on one river for 4,000 years. Which means, somewhere in Germany right now, there are men walking around carrying the Y chromosome of the people whose civilization was replaced. They don't know it. Their ancestry apps don't flag it. The haplogroup is rare, but it's present. A living remnant. An echo of something that was supposed to be silent. And here's the thing that reframes the entire concept of German identity one final time. When ancient DNA from German and Danish populations in the early medieval period is compared side by side, the samples are, in many cases, genomically indistinguishable. The people that history records as Germans and the people history records as Danes, different languages, different kingdoms, different mythologies, different flags, were, at the biological level, the same population, divided by a political line drawn after the genetics had already stabilized. German and Danish in the genome is the same sentence written in two different alphabets. So here's where we actually are. We started with a man named Marcus, under a lamp in Hamburg, holding a number he didn't expect. 28%. Steppe ancestry. From people he'd never heard of, from a place he'd never been, arriving through a chain of displacement and replacement that goes back further than agriculture, further than writing, further than every institution humans have ever built to make sense of who we are. The steppe migrants who carried his paternal lineage into Germany were themselves the product of a Caucasus mixing event that nobody named. The farmers they replaced came from Anatolia, and they replaced hunter-gatherers who had lived in those wetlands for thousands of years before them. And those hunter-gatherers replaced, or mixed with, the first anatomically modern humans who walked into Europe from Africa at the end of the last ice age. The chain doesn't stop. Every time you find the origin, there's another origin behind it. And what does that do to the word German? If you want to know what this means for your own ancestry, if you carry European DNA anywhere in your genome, subscribe and stay close. Because the next video in this series goes somewhere darker, into a specific ancient catastrophe that left a mark not just in European genomes, but in the genomes of people living right now in places that have no obvious connection to Bronze Age Europe at all.